This is the documentation for the rectangle class in our adhesive shapes API. And I wanted to go through a couple of the parts of this documentation so that we can then reverse engineer what this rectangle class looks like. So first you'll notice that there are three constructors. One that has no parameters, one that has a double parameter for length, and then one that has two parameters, one for length and one for width. And you'll notice that this documentation doesn't have the fields, and that's fairly common. Sometimes they won't include the fields in the documentation, but in this case you can sort of infer that if this is the constructor that has two parameters passed in, that these are probably the two fields that exist inside the rectangle class. And then we can go down here and we can actually check all the different methods that exist in this class. So we have get area, get length, get perimeter. Let's look at get area. So get area says calculates the area of this rectangle as a double. Okay, so I'm going to take the information that I've just learned and I'm going to go now and try writing the rectangle class. So here I have a blank slate for my public class rectangle. And I want to start by adding my fields. So I remember that there was a private int for length, or I assume that there is a private int for length and a private int for width. We didn't actually see these two in the documentation, but we could infer that from looking at the constructor. And so then for my constructors, I'll just write the last one for now, but you could go back and look at all three of them later if you wanted to. But I remember that there was one where they passed in the length and the width. And then here, they must have set the length. So I'll do length equals len and width equals width. Now, you may be saying, well, wait, why didn't you add the accessors and mutators? And you'd be absolutely right. I'm being a little lazy right now just for demonstration purposes, but you could certainly go down here and add in your accessors and mutators so that we call them from within this constructor instead of just directly setting them. We'll let it slide for now. So the next method that I wanted to add was a method for calculating the area. And remember, get area returned a double, and it had no parameters, but then the calculation for that, we can figure out for a rectangle, you've probably done this in geometry class, is going to be return length times width. This would be a problem if we didn't cast this to a double, because remember that we need to return a double for this method. All right, so there you can see how we've reverse engineered some of the aspects of the rectangle class. Oops, I see I made a mistake here, better capitalize R. But that's one of the benefits of being able to read documentation, is that you can reverse engineer what's inside of a class. It also is generally not just for reverse engineering, but it's also for just using that class in your own code. But the coding activity for this lesson is going to be for you to practice reading some documentation and then reverse engineering that on your own and designing a right triangle class. And then we've written some testing code so that you can actually test it and make sure that you did it correctly. Good luck. All right, folks, you made it to the end of documenting your classes or documentation lesson. And at this point, it's now going to be expected of you that you add documentation to all the code that you write. Now, believe me, I know that when you're programming and you get in the zone, you may not want to stop and pause to actually write documentation. That's okay. But there are two things that I'll say. First of all, commenting your code can be a really good way to understand what you've actually done and to debug it. Okay, so commenting is always a good practice while you're writing code, or especially if you're stuck. But the second thing I would say is that when you're done writing a program, it's important to review what you've done so that you can understand the steps that you took, and that eventually will actually make you a better programmer because you'll be able to analyze the code that you yourself have written and look for improvements in that code. So from now on, whenever you're working on a project, before you are finished, it's important that you add documentation to your Java code.